The opening segment of a podcast episode is a critical moment. It must pull the listener in, set the scene, and establish the stakes. For a story as powerful as the 1999 Moore tornado, the key is to start with the ordinary to make the extraordinary land with full force. Here is the opening segment. It was the afternoon of Monday, May the 3rd, 1999 in central Oklahoma, and the sky over the city of Moore was the color of a deep, unhealed bruise. The air was heavy, thick with moisture you could almost taste, and it was perfectly still. Not a leaf moved, not a flag stirred on its pole. It was the kind of stillness that feels unnatural, like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something it knows is coming but cannot name. In the neighborhoods south of Oklahoma City, lawns were clipped short, basketball hoops stood at attention in driveways, and children were just getting home from school. Parents pulled into garages, thinking about dinner, thinking about homework, thinking about the ordinary rhythm of a Monday evening. They did not know that in just a few hours, the most powerful tornado ever recorded on Earth would be carving a path of absolute destruction through their streets. They did not know that the wind would become a monster. To understand what happened that day, you have to understand the air. The air over Oklahoma that afternoon was a volatile cocktail of ingredients that weather forecasters dread and dream of diagnosing. A strong low-pressure system was spinning up out of the Rocky Mountains, pulling warm, humid air north from the Gulf of Mexico. That warm air met a cool, dry layer of air moving in from the west. This is the classic recipe for severe storms in Tornado Alley, but on this day the ingredients were not just present, they were perfect. Meteorologists watching the data from their offices in Norman, Oklahoma, could see the instability building. The dew points were in the 70s, a dangerously high level of moisture. The wind shear, the change in wind speed and direction with height was extreme. The atmosphere was being wound up like a tight spring. All it needed was a trigger. That trigger came in the form of a dry line, a boundary between the moist air to the east and the dry air to the west. By early afternoon, storms began to fire along that line near the Texas and Oklahoma panhandle. These were not ordinary thunderstorms. They were supercells, rotating giants that tower miles into the sky. One of these supercells formed near the town of Chickasha, southwest of Oklahoma City, and it began to move. It moved slowly at first, almost lazily, but it carried within it a fury that would soon be unleashed. Inside that storm, the rotation tightened. A wall cloud lowered, a dark, ragged collar of cloud that hung beneath the main storm base. People on the ground who knew what to look for watched it with a mix of awe and dread. And then the wall cloud began to spin. A slender rope of cloud reached down from the base, twisting and dancing. Within seconds, that rope thickened, widened, and touched the earth. The 1999 Moore tornado was born. It touched down just after 6:50 p.m., about 15 miles southwest of the city of Moore. At first, it looked like a classic tornado, a dark funnel with a narrow base, but it did not stay narrow for long. As it moved northeast, it began to grow. It consumed dust and debris, turning from a pale gray to a terrible black. The sound started as a low rumble, like a freight train far off in the distance, but it quickly escalated into a continuous, deafening roar that shook the ground and vibrated through people's chests. Those who heard it said it sounded like 1,000 jets' engines all running at full power at the same time, impossibly loud, a sound that was less heard than felt. The tornado was not just big, it was violent in a way that defied all previous measurements. As it crossed the Canadian River and moved into the southern suburbs of Oklahoma City, it entered a phase of intensity that stunned even the veteran storm chasers who were watching it. The funnel expanded until it was more than a mile wide. It was a wedge tornado, a massive wall of spinning cloud that stretched from the ground to the upper atmosphere. Within that wedge, Doppler radar detected winds that had never been seen before. Weather scientist Joshua Werman was leading a research team with a mobile Doppler radar unit parked in the path of the storm. He watched in disbelief as the radar displayed wind speeds of over 300 miles per hour. At one point, the radar registered a wind gust of 301 miles per hour. It was the highest wind speed ever recorded on the surface of the Earth. The tornado had become a weapon of nature. Now, think about what a wind of 300 miles per hour means. Most tornadoes have winds of 100 to 200 miles per hour, which is enough to destroy houses and toss cars. But 300 miles per hour is another category entirely. At that speed, the wind exerts immense pressure. It does not just break windows, it can pulverize concrete, it can strip asphalt from roads, it can drive straws through wooden planks, it can lift a fully loaded semi-truck into the air and throw it as if it were a toy. The air itself becomes a grinding, sandblasting force. In terms of the enhanced Fujita scale, a scale used to rate tornado intensity based on damage, this tornado was an EF5, the highest category. In terms of raw power, it was off the charts. The tornado's path was almost perfectly straight, a line of destruction that cut through the heart of suburban Oklahoma. It hit the town of Bridge Creek first, a small community that was virtually wiped from the map. Houses were flattened into piles of splinters. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to debris fields where no single structure was left standing. The tornado then moved into the city of Moore. Moore is a working-class suburb, a place of neat subdivisions, strip malls, and schools. It is the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where kids ride bikes down quiet streets, where the biggest worry on a Monday evening is what to have for dinner. That evening, the worry became survival. The tornado struck Moore with a direct, devastating hit. It crossed telephone lines, snapped power poles like matchsticks, and ripped roofs off of homes as if they were paper. In the Warren Theater District, the storm tore through a shopping center, destroying a movie theater and a grocery store. Cars in the parking lot were flipped end over end, crumpled into balls of twisted metal. But the most heartbreaking destruction came in the residential areas. On streets like Santa Fe Avenue and Southwest 4th Street, homes were completely removed from their foundations. All that remained in some places were bare concrete slabs. In other places, not even the slabs were left. The wind scoured the ground clean, leaving only dirt. People who survived that night would never forget what they saw. A woman named Lisa, who lived in a small house on the south side of Moore, was in her living room when the power went out. She heard the roar and knew she had to get to the bathroom, the only interior room in her house without windows. She grabbed her young son and her dog and huddled in the bathtub, covering her son with her own body. She felt the house tremble, then shake violently. She heard the sound of glass shattering and wood splintering. The pressure in her ears changed, a painful popping sensation. Then the roof was gone. She looked up and saw the sky dark and churning directly above her. The walls of the bathroom fell outward, and she was suddenly exposed, crouching in a tub with nothing but open air around her. The tornado had removed every part of her house except the bathtub where she lay. She was lifted slightly, the wind pulling at her clothes and hair, but she held onto her son. And then, as quickly as it began, the wind stopped. The tornado had passed over her, leaving her alive in a heap of rubble that had once been her home. That same scene was repeated hundreds of times across Moore and the surrounding areas. In the aftermath, the death toll would reach 36 people, with hundreds more injured. The property damage was estimated at over $1 billion. But those numbers do not capture the full weight of the event. They do not capture the story of the father who found his wife alive in the wreckage of their home, or the children who were pulled from the ruins of a daycare center, or the families who waited for hours not knowing if their loved ones were safe. The 1999 Moore tornado was not just a meteorological event. It was a traumatic scar on the landscape and on the memory of an entire community. It changed the way Oklahomans think about weather. Before that day, tornadoes were a known risk, a part of life on the plains. After that day, they were something more. They were a force that could erase everything you owned, everything you loved in a matter of seconds. The storm became a benchmark, a reference point for all future tornadoes. Meteorologists would study it for years. Engineers would use the damage to improve building codes. Survivors would carry the weight of that Monday for the rest of their lives. The story of the 1999 Moore tornado is a story of awe and terror, of destruction and resilience. It is a story that begins on a quiet Monday evening and ends with a city in ruins. But before we get to the end, we have to walk through the storm itself. We have to understand the science that made it possible, the warnings that were issued, and the choices that people made as the sky turned black. We have to listen to the voices of those who were there, who saw the wedge approach, who held their children close, who prayed to a God they hoped was listening. This is the story of the Moore tornado. This is the story of the day the wind broke all records. The storm that evening was not a surprise. Meteorologists had been tracking the atmospheric conditions for days, watching a pattern that seemed almost too perfect for disaster. A powerful jet stream was sweeping across the southern plains, pulling warm, moist air north from the Gulf of Mexico. At the same time, a dry line was pushing east from the Rocky Mountains, creating a clash of air masses that was unstable and volatile. On the afternoon of May 3rd, the Storm Prediction Center in Norman, Oklahoma, issued a high risk for severe thunderstorms and tornadoes across central Oklahoma. It was the kind of forecast that made weather professionals sit up straighter in their chairs. They knew something big was coming, they just did not know how big. The first tornadoes of the day touched down in the early afternoon, but they were small and short-lived. The atmosphere needed time to charge. By late afternoon, the instability had reached extraordinary levels. The dew points were in the upper 60s and low 70s. The wind shear, the change in wind speed and direction with height, was extreme. The cap, a layer of warm air that usually prevents storms from developing, was breaking. And when that cap breaks in Oklahoma in spring, the results can be catastrophic. Around 6:30 p.m., a supercell thunderstorm formed near the town of Hobart, about 100 miles southwest of Oklahoma City. This was not an ordinary thunderstorm. Supercells are the most dangerous kind of storm, rotating mesocyclones that can produce tornadoes for hours. This particular supercell was a monster from the start. It grew rapidly, its updraft so powerful that it punched through the tropopause, the boundary between the troposphere and the stratosphere. On radar, it looked like a massive donut, a ring of rotation with a hole in the center where the updraft was pulling air upward at speeds of over 150 miles per hour. The storm was feeding on the instability, drinking in the warm, moist air and spinning faster and faster. At 6:50 p.m., the tornado touched down. It was not a weak tornado at first. It was already an EF3 with winds over 150 miles per hour. But it was still relatively small, maybe 100 yards wide. The storm chasers who were following it, professionals and amateurs alike, knew they had something special on their hands. The tornado was moving northeast at about 30 miles per hour, a moderate forward speed that gave people time to react but not much time. And as it crossed the Canadian River, something changed. The Canadian River in that part of Oklahoma is a wide, sandy riverbed, often dry or with only a trickle of water. The tornado moved over that open ground and it began to expand. This is a known phenomenon. When a tornado moves from rugged terrain into flat, open land, it can strengthen and widen because there is less friction to disrupt the inflow of warm air into the mesocyclone. But the expansion that happened on May 3rd was beyond anything meteorologists had seen. The funnel widened from a few hundred yards to over a mile in a matter of minutes. It became a wedge tornado, a massive swirling cloud that filled the entire horizon from north to south. On the ground, people who saw it described it as a black wall moving toward them, a wall that seemed to stretch from one end of the sky to the other. The storm chasers who were positioned ahead of the tornado had to scramble to get out of its way. One of them, a veteran named Roger Edwards, was driving on Interstate 44 when he saw the wedge emerge from the dust and rain. He later said that it was the most terrifying thing he had ever witnessed, that the tornado looked like a living thing, a giant breathing entity that was hunting for anything in its path. Edwards turned his vehicle around and drove east, trying to outrun the storm. He watched in his rearview mirror as the tornado swallowed a small farmhouse, reducing it to a cloud of debris in seconds. Meanwhile, at the University of Oklahoma, a team of researchers led by Joshua Werman was parked in the path of the storm with a mobile Doppler radar unit called DOW, the Doppler on wheels. They had positioned themselves near the intersection of Interstate 44 and Highway 9, about 10 miles southwest of Moore. They watched as the tornado approached, its base rotating so fast that they could see the individual cloud tags whipping around the center. Werman later said that the radar display went haywire. The wind speeds were so high that the radar struggled to keep up. For a few seconds, the data showed a gust of 301 miles per hour. It was the highest wind speed ever recorded at the Earth's surface. The team was speechless. They had just measured a tornado that was stronger than any in recorded history. But the tornado was not done, it was still intensifying. As it moved into the suburban sprawl of Oklahoma City, it entered a phase that researchers would later call an extreme vortex. The winds became so strong that they stripped the bark off trees, disintegrated asphalt, and drove splinters of wood through concrete walls. In the Warren Theater area, the tornado ripped through a strip mall, destroying a movie theater and a grocery store. Cars in the parking lot were picked up and thrown like dice. One car was found wrapped around a light pole, the metal twisted into a knot. Another car was deposited on the roof of a nearby building, as if placed there by an invisible hand. The residential neighborhoods of Moore were the hardest hit. On streets like Santa Fe Avenue and Southwest 4th Street, entire blocks were reduced to rubble. Houses that had been built with wood frames and brick exteriors were simply gone. What remained was a collection of foundation slabs, some of them splintered and cracked from the force of the wind. In some places, even the foundations were gone, torn out of the ground and scattered like puzzle pieces. The tornado had scoured the earth so deeply that it exposed the soil beneath, a raw brown scar that would take years to heal. In the midst of this devastation, there were small miracles. A woman named Carolyn was in her home on Southwest 4th Street when the tornado hit. She was a grandmother, 62 years old, living alone. When she heard the roar, she went into her hallway and lay down on the floor, covering her head with her hands. She felt the house lift up around her, and then she was flying. She later said she remembered spinning, tumbling through the air with pieces of her house. She landed in a field about a quarter-mile away, still alive, with only a broken arm and a few cuts. She was one of the lucky ones. Others were not so fortunate. The death toll that night reached 36. Among the victims were a mother and her 2 children found in the ruins of their home. There was a man who had been driving home from work, his car thrown into a creek. There was a family who had taken shelter in their bathroom, only to have the walls collapse on them. The tornado did not discriminate. It destroyed rich neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods, old houses and new houses. It took the lives of the young and the old, the prepared and the unprepared. In the aftermath, the rescue efforts began almost immediately. Neighbors dug through the debris with their bare hands, calling out for survivors. Firefighters and police officers arrived within minutes, but the scale of the destruction was overwhelming. Roads were blocked by downed power lines and piles of wreckage. Gas leaks were everywhere. The darkness made the search even more difficult as the tornado had knocked out the power grid for miles around. Portable generators and flashlights provided the only light, casting long shadows over the desolate landscape. One of the most heartbreaking scenes was at a daycare center that had been flattened. The children had been evacuated to a basement just minutes before the tornado hit. They survived. But the building was gone, and the parents who rushed there had to wait in agonizing uncertainty until their children were brought out, one by one, covered in dust but alive. It was a moment of relief in a sea of tragedy. As the night wore on, the full extent of the damage became clear. More than 1,000 homes were destroyed or severely damaged. Hundreds of businesses were leveled. The estimated cost of the damage was over $1 billion, making it one of the most expensive tornadoes in history at that time. But the cost in human terms was immeasurable. The trauma of that night would linger for years, affecting survivors, first responders, and the entire community of Moore. The 1999 Moore tornado also changed the way meteorologists understand tornadoes. The wind speed measurement of 301 miles per hour forced a rethinking of tornado intensity. The enhanced Fujita scale was revised, with new damage indicators that better reflected the power of such storms. Buildings in tornado-prone areas began to be built with stronger materials and better anchoring systems. Safe rooms and storm shelters became more common in new construction. But despite all the scientific advances, the memory of that night remains a sobering reminder of nature's power. The stories of survival from that night are countless. There is the story of a man named David, who was driving on Interstate 35 when the tornado crossed the highway. He saw the wedge approaching from the southwest, and he pulled over and ran to a concrete overpass, the classic but dangerous shelter that many people mistakenly believe is safe. He huddled against the concrete pillars as the tornado passed overhead. He later said he felt the wind trying to pull him away from the structure, that he had to wrap his arms around the pillar and hold on with all his strength. When the storm passed, he was still alive, but his car was gone, swept away by the wind. He walked for miles through the debris to find help. And there is the story of a woman named Margaret who was in her home on Santa Fe Avenue when the tornado struck. She had no basement, no safe room. She grabbed her cat and her Bible and crawled into the bathtub. She prayed as the house came apart around her. She felt the wind lift her up, but she held onto the edge of the tub. When the storm passed, she was in the backyard, still in the bathtub, surrounded by wreckage. Her cat was still in her arms, alive. She said that night that God must have had a reason for keeping her alive, even if she did not understand it. The 1999 Moore tornado was a defining moment in the history of natural disasters in the United States. It was a storm that broke records, shattered communities, and left a lasting imprint on the landscape and the psyche of a region. But it was also a storm that showed the resilience of the human spirit. In the days and weeks that followed, volunteers from across the country came to Moore to help with the cleanup and rebuilding. Churches, nonprofits, and ordinary citizens donated money, food, and supplies. The community came together to support one another, to mourn the dead, and to begin the long process of recovery. The tornado was a reminder that nature does not care about our plans, our schedules, or our comfort. It can change everything in an instant. But it also showed that even in the darkest moments, there is hope. There is the hope that comes from neighbors helping neighbors, from strangers offering a hand, from the simple act of surviving and choosing to rebuild. The 1999 Moore tornado is a story of devastation, yes, but it is also a story of strength, of a community that refused to be broken. And that is a story worth telling. As the sun rose over Moore the morning after the tornado, the true scope of the destruction came into harsh focus. Dawn revealed a landscape that looked more like a war zone than a suburban community. Where there had been rows of houses with neatly trimmed lawns and picket fences, there were now piles of splintered wood, twisted metal, and shattered glass. The streets once lined with trees were now barren corridors of debris. The air was thick with the smell of natural gas, dust, and the faint, sickly sweetness of something worse. Rescue workers moved methodically through the rubble, calling out for survivors, listening for any sound of life beneath the wreckage. Every now and then, a shout would go up, and a team would converge on a spot to dig with renewed urgency. Among the first responders was a firefighter named Mark, who had been on duty when the tornado struck. He had ridden out the storm in the fire station, listening to the radio reports as the tornado carved its path through the city. As soon as the winds died down, he and his crew were out the door, navigating through streets that had become obstacle courses of downed power lines, overturned cars, and collapsed structures. Mark later described the scene as something out of a nightmare. He said that the silence was the most unsettling part. In a place that should have been filled with the sounds of morning traffic and children playing, there was only the occasional groan of shifting debris and the distant wail of sirens. He and his team worked through the morning without stopping, pulling people out of basements and crawl spaces, comforting the injured, and marking the locations of the dead with flags. One of the most challenging rescues took place at a church that had been holding a prayer meeting when the tornado hit. The church was a sturdy brick building, but the tornado had torn off the roof and collapsed several walls. Inside, a dozen people had huddled in a small room near the altar. When the storm passed, they were trapped under a pile of bricks and beams. The rescue team had to use heavy equipment to lift the debris, carefully working to avoid causing further collapse. It took 4 hours to reach the survivors. All of them were alive, but several were seriously injured. One woman, a grandmother named Ethel, was pinned under a pew for most of that time. She later said that she kept herself calm by singing hymns under her breath, even as the dust choked her lungs. When the rescuers finally pulled her out, she was still singing, a soft, trembling version of Amazing Grace. The firefighter stood in silence for a moment, moved by her resilience. The local hospital was overwhelmed. Emergency rooms that had prepared for a busy evening were now facing a flood of patients with injuries ranging from cuts and bruises to crushed limbs and internal bleeding. The hospital staff worked around the clock, triaging patients in the hallways, performing surgeries in rooms lit by emergency generators. Doctors and nurses who had already completed their shift stayed to help, ignoring their own exhaustion. The hospital parking lot became a staging area for helicopters bringing in the most severely injured from outlying areas. One nurse later recalled seeing a man who had been impaled by a 2x4, the wooden plank still protruding from his chest. He was conscious and talking, asking about his family. She told him they were safe even though she did not know. She said that often, the most important thing a rescuer could do was offer hope, even when the truth was uncertain. Meanwhile, the search for the missing continued. Families gathered at the local school, which had been set up as a reunification center. They stood in lines, clutching photographs of their loved ones, waiting for any word. The Red Cross volunteers handed out water and blankets, but there was little they could do to ease the anguish. Some families were reunited quickly, with tearful embraces that brought relief to everyone watching. Others waited for hours, only to receive the devastating news that their loved ones had not survived. One mother, whose son was missing, ran through the streets calling his name until her voice gave out. She was finally found by a neighbor, who gently led her to a triage tent where her son was being treated for a broken leg. The relief was overwhelming, but for every story of reunion, there was another story of loss. The days that followed were a blur of recovery and mourning. The National Guard was deployed to help with the cleanup, and they went door to door, searching for any survivors who might have been overlooked. Dogs trained in cadaver detection were brought in to find the dead. It was a grim task, but a necessary one. The bodies were taken to a temporary morgue set up at the county fairgrounds where forensic teams worked to identify them. The process was slow and heartbreaking. Many of the victims had to be identified through dental records or personal effects, as their bodies were too badly damaged to be recognized by family. The community of Moore began to hold vigils. On the first Saturday after the tornado, thousands of people gathered in a park that had somehow been spared from the destruction. They held candles and sang hymns, and they listened as their mayor spoke about resilience and rebuilding. But the words felt hollow to some who had lost everything and could not yet imagine a future. Among the crowd was a man named Robert, whose wife and daughter had been killed when their house collapsed. He stood at the back of the vigil, silent and still, clutching a small teddy bear that had belonged to his daughter. He later told a reporter that he had no anger, only emptiness. He said that he did not know how he would go on, but that he would try because that was what his wife would have wanted. The tornado also left a deep psychological scar on the survivors. In the weeks and months that followed, many people in Moore began to experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. The sound of thunder would send them diving for cover. The sight of a dark cloud on the horizon would trigger panic attacks. Children who had lived through the storm were terrified of the dark, of wind, of being alone. Counselors were brought in to help, but the healing was slow. Some families chose to leave Moore, unable to bear the memories. Others stayed, determined to rebuild their lives on the same ground that had nearly taken them. The scientific community, too, was forever changed by the Moore tornado. The wind speed measurement of 301 miles per hour was a shock, but it also opened new questions. How could a storm produce such extreme winds? What conditions had aligned to create that perfect, terrifying vortex? Meteorologists pored over the data from the radar, the damage surveys, and the eyewitness accounts. They discovered that the tornado had undergone a phenomenon known as cyclic mesocyclogenesis, where the parent thunderstorm generated a series of smaller vortices that fed into the main funnel, intensifying its rotation. This process was poorly understood at the time, but the Moore tornado provided a case study that would lead to new research. The enhanced Fujita scale, which had been in development, was finalized and implemented in 2007, in large part due to the insights gained from the Moore tornado and other extreme storms. The new scale included better damage indicators for different types of structures, such as well-built homes, schools, and industrial buildings. It also added a category for EF5 damage, which required evidence of incredible destruction, like the scouring of asphalt or the twisting of steel beams. The Moore tornado became the benchmark for what an EF5 could do, a reference point for every future storm. But even as the science advanced, the human stories remained at the heart of the tragedy. In the months after the tornado, a group of survivors formed a support network called Moore Strong. They met weekly to share their stories, to cry together, and to help each other navigate the practical challenges of rebuilding. They organized community cleanups, raised funds for families who had lost everything, and lobbied for stronger building codes. One of the founders, a woman named Diane, said that the group was born out of necessity. She had lost her home and her husband in the tornado, and she had felt completely alone until she found others who understood. She said that the tornado had taken everything from her, but it had also given her a new family. The rebuilding process was slow and difficult. Homeowners struggled with insurance claims, which were often denied or delayed. Contractors were overwhelmed with demand, and prices for materials soared. Some families chose to rebuild exactly as before, hoping to reclaim a sense of normalcy. Others took the opportunity to build safer homes, with reinforced concrete walls, impact-resistant windows, and underground storm shelters. The city of Moore updated its building codes to require new houses to be able to withstand winds of up to 150 miles per hour. But even with these changes, the people of Moore knew that no building could be completely safe from a tornado like the one they had survived. They were living in Tornado Alley, and the risk was always there. 1 year after the tornado, a memorial was unveiled in a small park near the intersection of Santa Fe Avenue and Southwest 4th Street. The memorial consisted of a series of granite pillars, each engraved with the name of a victim. Around the pillars, there was a garden of native wildflowers designed to bloom every spring. Survivors gathered for the dedication ceremony, many of them wearing shirts that bore the names of loved ones they had lost. They listened to speeches, laid wreaths, and released balloons into the sky. It was a somber occasion, but also a hopeful one. The memorial was a testament to the lives that had been lost, but also to the strength of a community that had refused to be defeated. As the years passed, the memory of the 1999 Moore tornado began to fade from the national headlines. New storms came, new tragedies unfolded, and the attention of the world moved on. But for the people of Moore, the tornado remained a defining moment in their lives. It was a line that divided their history into before and after. Those who had lived through it carried the scars, both visible and invisible. They remembered the sound of the wind, the feel of the ground shaking, the sight of their homes swirling into the sky. They remembered the faces of the people they had lost, the neighbors who had dug them out of the rubble, the strangers who had shown up with food and water. The 1999 Moore tornado was not just a weather event. It was a test of human endurance, a reminder of the fragility of life, and a demonstration of the power of community. In the years that followed, Moore rebuilt not just its houses and businesses, but its spirit. New families moved in, drawn by the affordable housing and the strong sense of community. The schools were rebuilt, the churches were rebuilt, and the lives of the survivors slowly began to find a new rhythm. But the tornado never fully left them. It was there in the way they watched the sky, in the way they held their children a little tighter during a thunderstorm, in the way they said goodbye to each other at the end of the day, as if it might be the last time. And then, nearly 14 years later, on the afternoon of May 20th, 2013, the sky over Moore began to darken again. The sirens blared once more, and the people of Moore, with their hard-won knowledge and their deep-seated fear, took shelter. They knew that they had faced the worst before, and they would face it again. The story of the 1999 tornado was not just a memory. It was a lesson, written into the very landscape of the town and into the hearts of its people. And as the clouds gathered and the wind began to rise, they braced themselves for whatever was coming next. The sirens began to wail over Moore just before 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the sound was like a ghost from the past. For those who had lived through 1999, the sirens were not just a warning, they were a summons to relive the nightmare. Children who had been toddlers during the first tornado were now teenagers, old enough to understand the danger but young enough to feel invincible. Their parents, however, remembered the roar of the wind and the trembling of the earth. They remembered pulling bodies from the rubble and waiting for news of missing loved ones. As the sirens blared on that May afternoon in 2013, they moved with practiced urgency, gathering their families, their pets, and their emergency kits, and heading for whatever shelter they had prepared. The storm that approached Moore that day was different from the one in 1999, but it was no less terrifying. It had formed from a supercell thunderstorm that had been tracking across central Oklahoma, and by the time it reached the outskirts of town, it had already achieved a level of intensity that made meteorologists sit up straighter in their chairs. The radar showed a debris ball, a telltale signature of a large tornado on the ground, and the velocity readings indicated winds that were off the charts. The National Weather Service issued a tornado emergency for Moore, the highest level of warning, urging everyone to take cover immediately. It was the same kind of warning that had been issued 14 years earlier, and for many, it carried the same weight of dread. The tornado touched down just west of Newcastle and moved eastward, growing larger and more violent with every passing minute. It was a wedge tornado, its funnel stretching nearly 1.5 miles across, and it moved at a slow, deliberate pace, as if savoring the destruction it was about to inflict. The first structures to feel its force were the homes on the edge of town, and they were obliterated almost instantly. The tornado ripped through neighborhoods with the same methodical fury that had characterized the 1999 storm, reducing houses to piles of splintered lumber, twisting cars into knots, and stripping the bark from trees. The sound was the same, too, that deep, continuous roar that survivors had described as the sound of a freight train, a jet engine, 1,000 lions. It was a sound that could not be forgotten, and it was a sound that could not be escaped. The people of Moore had learned from the past. Many of them had installed storm shelters in their garages or buried in their backyards. Others had built safe rooms with reinforced concrete and steel doors. The city had updated its building codes, and newer homes were constructed to withstand higher winds. But not everyone had the resources to build a safe room, and not every home could be retrofitted. As the tornado approached, hundreds of families huddled in bathtubs in closets in the interior hallways of their homes, hoping that the walls would hold. They listened to the roar, felt the pressure changes that made their ears pop, and prayed that the storm would pass them by. One of the neighborhoods that took a direct hit was the Briarwood Addition, a community of well-built homes that had been constructed after the 1999 tornado. Many of these houses had been designed to meet the new codes, but the tornado was stronger than anything the codes had anticipated. The winds were estimated to have reached 200 miles per hour, and at the core of the vortex they may have been even higher. The tornado tore through Briarwood with a fury that seemed personal, flipping houses off their foundations, shredding roofs, and scattering debris across miles of open country. When the storm passed, the neighborhood was unrecognizable, reduced to a grid of concrete slabs and scattered belongings. One of the most heartbreaking stories to emerge from the 2013 tornado was the destruction of Plaza Towers Elementary School. The school was located in the path of the storm, and despite the warnings, not all of the students had been able to reach the designated shelter areas before the tornado arrived. The school had been built in the 1970s, long before the current building codes, and its construction was not designed to withstand the winds of a violent tornado. When the storm hit, the roof collapsed and the walls gave way. The children and teachers who had taken cover in the hallways were buried under the rubble. Rescue workers arrived within minutes, but the scene was chaotic. Parents who had been at work or at home rushed to the school, desperate for news of their children. They clawed through the debris with their bare hands, calling out the names of their sons and daughters. The first reports were confusing, with conflicting accounts of how many children were trapped and how many had been rescued. As the sun began to set and the rescue effort continued, the true scope of the tragedy became clear. 7 children had been killed in the collapse of Plaza Towers Elementary. They were all between the ages of 8 and 10, and they had been in the 3rd grade. The names of the children who died at Plaza Towers became a part of the town's memory in the same way that the names of the victims from 1999 had. There was Christopher, who wanted to be a firefighter. There was Kyle, who loved baseball. There was Antonia, who dreamed of being a singer. Their faces appeared on news broadcasts and in the pages of newspapers across the country, and the nation mourned with more. But for the families who had lost their children, the grief was private and unbearable. They spoke to reporters in hushed voices, their eyes hollow with shock, struggling to find words that could convey the depth of their loss. Another school, Briarwood Elementary, was also destroyed, but the students and staff there had taken shelter in a reinforced safe room, and no one was killed. The contrast between the two schools highlighted the importance of building codes and the value of investing in storm protection. In the aftermath of the tornado, there was a renewed push to retrofit all schools in Oklahoma with safe rooms, but the cost was enormous and progress was slow. For the families who had lost children at Plaza Towers, the debate over funding and policy was a painful reminder of what could have been prevented. The search and rescue operation continued through the night and into the next day. Teams from across the state converged on Moore, bringing search dogs, thermal imaging cameras, and heavy equipment. They worked in shifts, combing through the rubble of homes, businesses, and schools, looking for survivors. The conditions were hazardous. There was gas leaking from broken pipes, down power lines, and unstable piles of debris that could collapse at any moment. The workers wore masks to protect themselves from the dust and the mold, and they moved with a caution born of experience. They knew that the first 48 hours were critical, and they were determined to save as many lives as they could. The final death toll from the 2013 Moore tornado was 24 people, including the 7 children at Plaza Towers. Over 300 others were injured, and the property damage was estimated at $2 billion. The tornado was rated an EF5, the same classification as the 1999 storm, and it was the second EF5 tornado to strike Moore in less than a decade and a half. The coincidence of 2 such extreme storms hitting the same small town was almost incomprehensible. Meteorologists studied the atmospheric conditions that had produced both events, looking for patterns that might help predict future storms. But in the end, the randomness of the tragedy was the hardest thing to accept. In the days after the tornado, the nation turned its attention to Moore once again. President Barack Obama visited the town, walking through the rubble and speaking with survivors. He promised federal aid and praised the resilience of the community. The American Red Cross set up shelters and distribution centers, and volunteers poured in from across the country. There were donations of food, water, clothing, and money, and there were offers of free labor from construction crews and contractors. The response was overwhelming, but it was also bittersweet. The people of Moore were grateful for the help, but they were also exhausted. They had been through this before, and they knew what lay ahead. The rebuilding would take years, and the emotional scars would last a lifetime. One of the most remarkable aspects of the 2013 tornado was the role of social media in the response. In 1999, the survivors had relied on landline telephones and face-to-face communication. By 2013, everyone had a smartphone, and the flow of information was instantaneous. People used Facebook and Twitter to share news of their safety, to coordinate rescue efforts, and to organize donations. The hashtag #MoreStrong, which had originated after the 1999 tornado, was revived and spread across the internet. It became a symbol of the town's determination to rebuild, and it was a reminder that the community was not alone. But even as the world sent its support, the people of Moore knew that they would have to do the hardest work themselves. The process of rebuilding after a tornado is not just about hammering nails and pouring concrete. It is about confronting the trauma that lingers in every shattered window and every broken wall. It is about learning to live with the fear that it could happen again. Many survivors from the 1999 tornado had spent the intervening years trying to put their lives back together. They had bought new furniture, planted new gardens, and made new memories. And then, in the span of less than an hour, they had lost everything again. The psychological impact of the 2013 tornado was different from that of the first storm, but it was no less severe. For those who had lived through both events, the recurrence of the trauma was almost too much to bear. They reported symptoms of survivor's guilt, wondering if they had done something to invite the disaster. They struggled with hypervigilance, scanning the sky for every sign of a storm, and they had difficulty sleeping, especially during the spring months. The sound of rain on the roof would send them into a panic, and the sight of a dark cloud on the horizon would trigger a flood of memories. Counselors warned that the cumulative effect of multiple disasters could lead to chronic mental health issues, and they urged survivors to seek help. But many found it hard to ask for support, preferring to suffer in silence. The children who had survived the 2013 tornado were particularly vulnerable. Some had been at Plaza Towers and they had witnessed the death of their classmates. Others had been trapped in the rubble of their homes, listening to the screams of their parents. In the weeks and months after the storm, these children exhibited signs of acute stress. They had nightmares, they wet the bed, and they refused to go to school. They drew pictures of tornadoes and discussed storms with a level of detail that disturbed their teachers. The school district brought in grief counselors, art therapists, and even therapy dogs to help the children process their experiences. But the healing was slow and it was incomplete. For many of these children, the tornado would be a defining moment in their lives, a before and after that would shape their personality, their choices, and their view of the world. In the midst of the tragedy, there were stories of heroism that offered a glimpse of the human capacity for courage. There was the teacher who shielded her students with her own body as the roof of the school collapsed. There was the neighbor who ran into a burning house to pull an elderly woman to safety. There was the rescue worker who spent 18 hours digging through the rubble, refusing to stop until every victim had been found. These stories were shared on the news and around the dinner tables of Moore, and they became part of the community's narrative. They were evidence that even in the face of the most devastating destruction, ordinary people could rise to extraordinary heights. As the weeks turned into months, the rebuilding of Moore began in earnest. The Federal Emergency Management Agency set up temporary housing for families who had been displaced, and the Army Corps of Engineers helped with the demolition of unsafe structures. Contractors worked around the clock to rebuild homes, and the city government updated its building codes once again, requiring even stronger construction standards for new buildings. The new codes mandated storm shelters in all new homes and required schools to have safe rooms that could withstand an EF5 tornado. It was a step forward, but it could not undo what had happened. The families who had lost children in the tornado became advocates for stronger safety regulations. They testified before the state legislature, spoke at community meetings, and participated in documentaries about the disaster. They channeled their grief into a mission to prevent future tragedies, and they found a sense of purpose in their advocacy. But their motivation was not just about changing policy. It was about honoring the memories of the children they had lost. Each new safe room that was built, each new building code that was implemented, was a tribute to the lives that had been cut short. 17 years after the first tornado and 3 years after the second, the town of Moore bears little resemblance to the scarred battlefield that the storms left behind. New homes have risen where the old ones stood, and the schools have been rebuilt with state-of-the-art safety features. The population has grown and the economy has recovered. But the memory of the tornadoes is woven into the fabric of the town in ways that are both visible and invisible. There are memorials in the parks, plaques on the walls of the new schools, and a museum dedicated to the history of the storms. But the deepest memories are carried in the hearts of the people who lived through them. They remember the sound of the wind, the feel of the ground shaking, the smell of the dust and the gasoline. They remember the faces of the ones they lost, and they remember the faces of the strangers who helped them. The story of Moore, Oklahoma, is a story of resilience, but it is also a story of vulnerability. It is a reminder that no matter how advanced our technology or how strong our buildings, we are not immune to the forces of nature. The tornadoes that struck Moore in 1999 and 2013 were not unique in their intensity, but they were unique in their specificity. They targeted a small town in the middle of the country, and they left a mark that will not fade for generations. The people of Moore have learned to live with the risk, and they have chosen to stay. They have built safe rooms and adopted emergency plans and taught their children what to do when the sirens sound. But they know, as all who live in Tornado Alley know, that the sky is always watching and the next storm is always possible. And so, on quiet evenings when the wind is still and the clouds are high, the people of Moore allow themselves to breathe. They sit on their porches and watch the sun set, and they remind themselves that the earth is beautiful and life is precious. They hold their children a little closer, and they say a quiet thank you for the day that passed without incident. They know that the peace may not last, but they have learned to cherish it while it does. The tornadoes have taught them to measure time in moments, to value each ordinary hour, and to find joy in the simple act of being alive. The 1999 Moore tornado is not just a chapter in the history of Oklahoma. It is a part of the collective memory of the United States, a reminder of the power of nature and the depth of human love. It is a story that continues to be told by survivors and scientists, by journalists and historians, by parents and children. It is a story of destruction and rebuilding, of mourning and resilience, of fear and hope. And as the years go by, it will remain a testament to the strength of a community that refused to be broken, and to the courage of ordinary people who faced the worst and chose to carry on. But the story does not end there. In the years that followed, the town of Moore became a case study for meteorologists and emergency managers who sought to understand why this particular region kept attracting the most violent tornadoes. Researchers from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration set up permanent monitoring stations around the area, collecting data on wind speeds, pressure changes, and storm structure. They discovered that the geography of central Oklahoma, with its flat plains and the convergence of warm, moist air from the Gulf and dry air from the Rockies, created a perfect environment for supercell formation. But they also found something more troubling. The storms that hit Moore seemed to follow a similar path, as if the landscape itself was channeling them toward the town. Scientists called this a tornado genesis fingerprint, and they warned that the chances of another EF5 tornado striking the same community were higher than anyone wanted to admit. For the residents of Moore, this scientific confirmation did little to ease their anxiety. They already knew that they lived in a bullseye. They had seen the destruction twice, and they had no reason to believe it would not happen again. Some families chose to leave after the 2013 tornado, selling their homes and moving to parts of the country that did not have tornado sirens. But the majority stayed. They stayed because Moore was their home, because their jobs were here, because their children were in school here, because the sense of community was too strong to abandon. They stayed and they adapted, building safe rooms and reinforcing their garages, keeping emergency kits in their cars and teaching their kids to recognize the difference between a watch and a warning. The city government, too, took unprecedented steps. In the wake of the 2013 disaster, Moore passed an ordinance requiring all new residential construction to include a storm shelter or a reinforced safe room. The law was controversial at first, with builders complaining about the cost and homeowners worrying about property values. But after a few years, it became the norm. Real estate agents began advertising homes with safe rooms as a selling point, and many families who had lived through the tornadoes refused to buy a house without one. The safe rooms became a symbol of Moore, as iconic as the red dirt or the oil derricks that dotted the horizon. But the most lasting change was in the hearts of the people. The tornadoes had taught them something profound about the brevity of life and the importance of connection. Neighbors who had been strangers before the storms became lifelong friends, bonded by the shared experience of huddling together in a closet while the world fell apart. Local churches organized support groups that continued to meet years after the debris was cleared. And at the annual memorial service held on the anniversary of the 1999 tornado, the crowd would swell with not only survivors but also their children and grandchildren, who had grown up hearing the stories and who now carried the memory forward. One of the most remarkable aspects of Moore's recovery was the way the community turned its grief into action. The parents who had lost children at Plaza Towers Elementary did not retreat into silence. They formed a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving school safety across the state. They lobbied the Oklahoma legislature to allocate funding for storm shelters in all public schools, and they traveled to Washington to testify before Congress about the need for better early warning systems. Their efforts led to the passage of the Oklahoma School Safety Act, which required every school district to have a plan for severe weather and provided grants for the construction of safe rooms. By 2020, more than 800 schools in Oklahoma had installed storm shelters, and the number was growing every year. The legacy of the Moore tornadoes also influenced the way meteorologists communicated with the public. Before 1999, tornado warnings were often issued with a generic sense of urgency. But after the devastation of that day, the National Weather Service began experimenting with impact-based warnings that described the potential for catastrophic damage. They developed a system of storm damage assessments that allowed them to rate tornadoes more accurately, and they worked with local media to create more dramatic and specific alerts. When a tornado warning was issued in Moore, it was no longer a simple text on a screen. It was a voice on the radio telling you to get underground, or a cell phone alert that made your entire body vibrate with fear. The technology improved too. Doppler radar became more sophisticated, allowing forecasters to see the rotation within a storm at a much finer resolution. They could now predict the formation of a tornado up to 20 minutes earlier than they could in 1999. And new mobile apps allowed residents to track storms in real time, showing them the exact path of the tornado and how close it was to their home. But even with all this technology, there was no substitute for human vigilance. The people of Moore knew that a warning was only as good as the action it inspired. They had learned to trust their instincts, to respect the sky, and to never ignore a siren. In the end, the story of the Moore tornado is not just a story of a single event or even two events. It is a story of how a community learned to live with the storm. It is a story of how tragedy can bring out the best in people, how grief can be transformed into purpose, and how a town that was nearly erased from the map can rise again, stronger and more united than before. The children who survived the Plaza Tower's collapse are now adults, some of them parents themselves. They carry the scars of that day, but they also carry the knowledge that they are part of something larger than themselves. They are the living proof that even in the face of the most unimaginable loss, life finds a way to continue. And so, as the sun sets over the plains of Oklahoma, the people of Moore go about their evening routines. They water their lawns, they watch the news, they tuck their children into bed. They know that the wind will blow again, that the clouds will gather, and that someday, perhaps soon, the sirens will sound once more. But they are ready. They have built their safe rooms and their support networks. They have made their peace with the risk. They have chosen to live fully, not in spite of the fear, but because of it. For in the end, the greatest lesson of the Moore tornado is not about destruction. It is about the resilience of the human spirit and the quiet courage of ordinary people who refuse to give up hope.